You guys are back in the old school. Hey guys, I'm the Retro Reject. So today's cartoon is CatScratch. CatScratch was an American-made Nickelodeon show that started in 2005 and then was canceled in 2007. The series was made by Doug TenNapel, who was also known for making Earthworm Jim. Oh, and I'm sorry if I pronounced your name wrong. The series revolves around three cats, Mr. Blick, Gordon, and Waffle. Well, their owner just died, and then they recently inherited all of her fortune, and now we follow them on their crazy and wacky adventures. Now, from my childhood, I really don't remember much about CatScratch. All I remember is that the show existed, and I remember it being very good. And I do remember the characters, of course, Gordon, Waffle, and Mr. Blick, as well as a few other characters like Kimberly and Clovis, I think that's his name. He's the butler, basically. And there was this fun little game that was on the Nickelodeon website that I remember playing all the time. Basically, it's kind of like CatScratch mixed with Angry Birds. Basically, you selected one cat, and you basically launched other projectiles at the other cats. So how I'm going to play this out now is that next I'm going to explain each of the characters and their different personalities. And then after that, I'm going to give a basically full synopsis of 2 episodes so you guys can get just a feel of what the episodes were like. Now first is Mr. Blick. Now he's basically the leader out of the three cats on the show. So, and he's also supposedly supposed to be the smartest, but he's not really. He can act like an idiot sometimes. Like in one of the episodes I'll explain later, it shows how stupid he is. And he's very selfish and full of himself, and he loves the fact that he's rich and always loves bragging about it and always bosses the others around. Next is Gordon. Now Gordon, he's kind of the more kind-hearted person of the group, and also he has a Scottish accent. I mean, he's not from Scotland for some reason. He just likes speaking in a Scottish accent, but he's a very kind-hearted person. And he's the more sensible one of the group. He's smarter than Mr. Blick, and he annoys him by that. But he's definitely smarter than Waffle. But for some reason, he has a crush on a human girl named Kimberly.
Kind of reminds me of someone you know.
Shut up, Nala.
Next is Waffles, and it's pretty much safe to say that Waffles, he's basically the idiot of the show. And he's amazed by the littlest of things. Like one time they went to the moon and he was just amazed by Mr. Blick pointing his finger. And he also has a love for newts for some reason. Alright, now on to Kimberly. Now, as I mentioned before, she is the love interest to Gordon. And she's basically the stereotypical 90s 8-year-old girl. For some reason, she's completely obsessed with unicorns and, just girly in nature. And she always sees the good in them, and also she's pretty much blissfully unaware of that Gordon has a crush on her. So, alright, last person I'm going to introduce is Clovis. At least I think that's how you say his name. Now, basically, there's nothing much to Clovis. It's just that he's the butler of the house, and he's not exactly interested in having to look after 3 cats that basically get into mischief all the time and always order him around. And, I mean, he's just there to make sure that they don't burn the house down.
So the very first episode of CatScratch is called Go to the Moon. Gee, I wonder what that episode is about. So the episode begins with Mr. Blick trying to cook some ribs on a barbecue because he's getting ready for a barbecue cooking contest. But the other cats, Waffles and Gordon, they know that Mr. Blick's cooking sucks. But Mr. Blick, he is just desperate to win. So Gordon decides to tell Mr. Blick the story of Duke Explain! The story goes is that the Duke wanted to make delicious ribs like Mr. Blick. So he decides to go to a seal woman so that he sells his soul to her, and so that he could get moon rocks that enhance the flavor of his ribs, in which they do. But Duke Explain! Feels empty inside knowing that his soul is missing, even though he has delicious ribs. But Mr. Blick basically gets the whole lesson of the story wrong and just thinks that if he goes to the moon and collects some moon rocks, he can enhance the flavor of his own ribs and win the barbecue cooking contest. So they turn their car that they have into a rocket ship and blast off to the moon. So while at the moon, Mr. Blick is still focused on getting his moon rocks, but Waffles gets a little distracted and decides to play some zero-G basketball. And also Gordon decides to make stone statues out of them on the moon to remember that they were there. And until he accidentally made that little cliche thing, like when you tap the rock, everything just crumbles. So that causes an avalanche, in which the rocks go straight into their car trunk. But as they try to blast off again, the rocks are just too heavy and weigh the ship down. So Waffles decides to get out of the ship and try to give the spaceship a little push while they blast off. And Mr. Blick and Gordon, they leave without Waffle. But as they're traveling back, they get a little bit upset knowing that they left their own friend on the moon without any food, water, or any sort of way to survive on the moon. But it just reveals that he was still in the ship the whole time. But how he got in was that he went through the trunk, got all the rocks out of the way, and put them back into space. So all three of them now get into a fight with each other, and it causes the shuttle door to open, and all the ribs that, for some reason, Mr. Blick thought it was a good idea to bring with him, they go flying out the window, and that they actually get caught in the exhaust port of the spaceship, and of course they cook the ribs, and they immediately crash land on Earth, and thus judging for the barbecue contest is started. So Mr. Blick doesn't have any ribs until they fall out of the sky, and you would think that the judge would enjoy the ribs. But the judge actually hates the ribs and gives Mr. Blick the award of the world's worst barbecue ribs. Gordon Waffles first thought that Mr. Blick would be upset, but actually Mr. Blick is pretty excited because he still won something. He just won the award of the world's worst barbecue ribs. So the second episode I'll be explaining is an episode called Go Go Gomez. So once again, the cats are getting ready to enter something, and this time it's a derby contest. It isn't until they run into their neighbors, the Chumpy Chump brothers, and they decide to make a deal with them of whoever wins the contest, they get that person's house. So if the cats win, they get the Chumpy Chump brothers' house, and if the Chumpy Chump brothers win, they get the cat's house. And then Waffles hilariously adds on is that they also get everything within the house. So the next day at the derby race, they're getting ready to start the race, but it turns out Mr. Blick can't drive the car because he's too short to drive. And as well as Gordon is too short. The only person who is left to drive is Waffles. And Mr. Blick makes it clearly clear that he does not want Waffles to drive at all. But knowing that there's a very high stake of that they could lose their house, Mr. Blick decides to let Waffles drive. So Waffles pulls out his lucky Newt Gomez, and they're ready to start the race. So everybody speeds off from the starting line, but Waffles is going really slow because he's trying to keep his Newt happy. But Mr. Blick gets so aggravated because it is a race after all. So he throws Gomez, in which lands on the Chumpy Chump brothers' car. So Waffles instinctively just basically slams on the gas, and then a whole race starts. Or it's of Waffles just trying to get his Newt back. So Waffles does get his Newt back, and it turns out they're only a couple of inches away from the finish line, and everybody else is still racing towards them. So Mr. Blick decides to throw Gomez again, and which they do win the race, and they get the Chumpy Chump brothers' house. So overall, I think CatScratch is at least what I think is one of the greatest childhood shows that I remember. And I think you guys should just try to find any way you can watch it. I mean, I've given you just basically the basic details of CatScratch. The episodes are so funny, and I think you guys need to watch them. So, until my next cartoon analysis, the old school is out!